Hello friends, I'm Michael Kingswood. I write fiction for fun and profit. Before we get to today's show, we have to do one thing real quick, and that's a little spot from our sponsor. Fortunately enough, our sponsor is me. In a world of valor and magic, two soldiers flee from their past. An isolated mountain town suffers under the heel of a vicious band of brigands. An offer of redemption for the one, salvation for the other, but not without great risk to both. Action and adventure await in Glimmer Vale, the first book of the Glimmer Vale Chronicles. Get your copy today, wherever great books are sold. It is Saturday, so it's time for Story Saturday, and I realized that I screwed up. I recorded the intro to this yesterday at the same time I was recording a music reaction video, and at the end of that reaction I said, hey, tomorrow's story is a military science fiction story. The reason I did that is because I recorded that video after I did this, and I was thinking about next week's story. This week is not military sci-fi, sorry to say. For those of you who came from that, that'll be next week. This week is more of a mystery. It's called Mantrap, and let's get right into it. I wrote it. I'm reading it. It's awesome. You'll probably like it. I'll talk to you when it's done. Gary should have known it was going to be a bad day when Tina Fingerson knocked on his door. In his defense, it had been a really, really long time since a pretty young lady had come by his place. Most of his clients were down-on-their-luck guys or women well past the wall. On the other hand, it was Tina, and he should have known better. Did know better. But there was always something about the way she looked at him with those seemingly innocent, baby brown eyes from beneath a seemingly stray strand of black bangs, head cocked to the side, slightly, in a look of near desperation. It didn't matter that he'd seen that look on her face a dozen times before, and never had it not been fake, or failed to get him in deeper waters than he preferred to wade, whether with the law, or the kinds of people you really didn't want to swim around with. When she showed up, neat on her face like she did this morning, he couldn't say no. So, feeling like a schmuck already, he pulled his office door more fully open and waved her inside. It wasn't a big office, just a single room and a closet on the third floor of a rather run-down commercial building a few blocks from the courthouse. It was dominated by his desk, an old-fashioned mountain of a piece that had almost certainly been hand-carved sometime in the late 19th century, and that was almost completely covered by his calendar blotter in the center, keyboard and monitor to the left from where he would sit, and 3 stacks of 5 or 6 manila folders, his active case files, to the right. 2 chairs, simple wooden jobs that looked like they were right out of IKEA, because they were, sat facing the desk, backs to the door. File cabinets lined the wall to the right of the desk, and the door to the room's closet was opposite them. A water cooler that took those 5-gallon jugs was in one corner behind his desk, adjacent to the file cabinets, and a narrow standing safe, big enough for a dozen long guns if you really wanted to store some in here, sat in the opposite. Light came from a small window behind his desk that he normally kept halfway open to also admit a breeze, from the hallway outside, through the frosted glass window in the upper half of the door, and from an overhead fan in the ceiling that spun with periodic squeaks and boasted a pair of old-fashioned luminescent light bulbs, because they were cheap and screwed the Karens in the government who wanted to force something else on him. But mostly because they were cheap. The place smelled of old papers and slightly of cigar smoke. Home, sweet home. He waved Tina into one of the chairs and appreciated the sway of her hips beneath the brightly floral summer dress she was wearing as she eased herself down into it. Then he pushed the door closed and walked around the desk, the opposite side of the desk from the chair she had selected, and settled down into his own. It squeaked slightly as it accepted his weight and leaned back a tad, and he looked at her. She fidgeted slightly with her little green handbag and would not meet his gaze, instead focusing on the calendar blotter atop his desk. Gary counted the squeaks from the overhead fan as he waited for her to tell him what she needed this time. He'd gotten to 30 and was about to tell her to spit it out when she said, "I would have called first, but I wasn't sure you'd see me." "Can you blame me?" She still didn't meet his eyes, but gave a little shake of her head. I guess not. More silence then, to the count of 5. Gary sighed. You gonna tell me what's going on? She didn't answer for a long moment. Finally, Gary cleared his throat. She looked up. Finally, and in her eyes was shame, guilt, but no fear. It's my ex-husband. He blinked. Come again? You have a husband? She shrugged slightly. Ex. It was before we met. High school thing that became more than I thought it would, and then it was too late, so... Her throat bobbed as she swallowed, and Gary cleared his throat again, looking away from her toward the frosted glass of his door. Gary's mind swept through the entire time he'd known her, the first meeting, out about the town when he was still looking for a woman, how she had seemed so enticing, so innocent, and he had let down his guard. Then how she had proven to be much less innocent than she seemed, much to his delight. And then the drama and the complications and the never-ending situations that she always seemed to get herself into, and that he felt obligated as a man not without compassion to help her out of, until she reached the last straw and he told her no more 6 months ago. Now here she was again, and he wanted to shout at the ceiling in frustration, because much as he knew she was only trouble, damn if she still wasn't the sexy but innocent-looking little minx that had drawn him in so easily before. No, this time he was not getting involved. Didn't matter how much swallowing she promised. And that, of course, led his mind to wander into the other areas that he had explored with her, and wasn't she something to be remembered and held on to? No, he forced himself to look back at her and put on a deep frown. As his eyes met hers, he noticed her expression shift slightly, from expectation to confusion and then to submissive shame, all in a heartbeat. Someone who hadn't trained himself to notice people's reactions would never have seen it. 2 years ago, Gary wouldn't have. But he did, and that reaction immediately quenched the carnal side of his psyche, which had, unbidden, begun contemplating the adventures she had subtly hinted at. She focused in on the wall in the direction of his safe. Anyway, I'm scared he's going to hurt me. Gary leaned back in his chair again and shrugged. So call the cops. I'm not in security. You know that. Tina blinked, then tried to smile at him. It's not like that. Oh, really? Then what is it? He thinks I owe him money. Ah. Gary shouldn't have been surprised from all the interactions he'd had with her, but somehow still he was. She was a good grifter. She had sucked him in at first, despite all his experience and self-discipline, so she had to be. That she had managed to fuck or otherwise con this guy out of some amount of money wasn't hard to believe. The part that was hard to believe was that some run-of-the-mill mark would have caught on to it, and that she would have left enough of a trail that he could have tracked her down. She wasn't from here, Gary knew that. Far as he could tell, she wasn't from anywhere, though her accent marked her from the Carolinas. Of course, that could be faked. Regardless, it should have been nigh on impossible for this guy to find her all these years later. Speaking of which, how long ago were you married to him? Tina flushed slightly. We broke up last summer. Gary did a double take. Last summer? That meant she was married to him when they first hooked up. He was no prude. He'd banged plenty of married girls before, but that was before he became a private eye and learned how easy it was for an adulterer or S to get caught, and how ripe for revenge a slighted spouse could be. A couple of his clients had put their cheating spouses into the hospital, one almost into the morgue, and it had only been a lot of tap dancing combined with some good lawyering from his attorney that had kept him from getting charged as an accessory, and no matter that he had no idea what his clients were going to do after he gave them the report of the spouse's activity. After that, he developed a solid no married women policy, and that part of his conscience that he thought he'd buried deep way back in high school piped up that should have been his policy from the beginning. Adultery was a sin, after all. He'd shoved that notion down hard. God didn't rule him. God didn't exist. That was his story, and he was sticking to it, no matter the haranguing from his deep psyche. All that went through his mind in a heartbeat, during which Gary made sure to keep his face professionally neutral. But Tina saw something in his expression that caused her lips to turn upwards a bit more than they had a few moments ago, though she said nothing. How much do you owe him? Nothing. But her eyes flicked away from him when she said it, giving away the lie. He's a degenerate gambler, always blaming his losses on me. But that was almost 6 months ago. She shrugged, and why I left. Gary looked away from her toward the clock mounted on the wall above his filing cabinets. It was 2:30. Too early to call it a day, though for a second he considered bluffing so as to force her to leave. But when he looked back at her, he saw that she wasn't going to leave, and he stifled an inward sigh. So what do you want me to do, deliver a blank check? She nodded briskly. Actually, yes. Gary blinked. Then he blinked again, surprise washing his initial reply from his mind until, after a 5 count, he could only say, "What?" Tina finally looked him square in the eye, and Gary was surprised to see honest resolve there. So he immediately began looking for the angle. "I don't owe him any money," Tina said, then continued before he could interject. "But I also left him in the middle of a weird business deal for him. I didn't think it would be a big deal, but," she shrugged, "he took it harder than I thought, and I heard he screwed up the deal and lost a bunch of money." "Right." That smile that had appeared so soon before left, replaced by a little scowl, but she said nothing. "You expect me to believe you give a damn about a guy you ran out on, whether he did well after you left or not?" Gary snorted. "Don't bullshit me. What's the angle?" Tina's eyes furrowed, and she actually kept her gaze locked with his for a few seconds before pulling away to look toward his safe again. But in those few seconds, he could see he was right. There was a big angle here, and she was trying hard to play it. He could press, but Gary had long ago learned to trust his instincts. And those said to keep quiet, just look at her. And she'd let the rest out from the oppression of silence, if nothing else. Finally, after he had gone through, counting to 25 in his head, she shrugged visibly and looked back at him. "Fine, if you must know, he's got a big development deal getting ready to get greenlit, but he's running short of capital, and he doesn't want to go to a bank." "How far short?" "About $500,000. Now it was Gary's turn to be baffled. "You don't have that much money." Tina raised her eyebrows. "Don't I?" But he stopped, clamping his mouth shut as his mind ran through the scenario, and he came up with the answer. "That little bitch. You've been playing me this whole time." Tina chuckled. "No more than you've been playing me, Gary. Or do you think I didn't know about your deal at Pahrump?" Gary blinked. "If you weren't a Vegas local, you probably had no idea that Pahrump was a thing, let alone that it was a real town. And they weren't in Vegas, they were in Riverside. How?" He didn't bother asking. Clearly, Tina was far more savvy than he had caught on to, which of course meant that he was much more of a sucker than he imagined he could have been, which didn't bode well for his private investigator business. Crap. But that didn't matter, not really, for today's business, or at least Gary hoped it didn't. "So you're going to buy into his business. Cool, good for you. Why is that my problem?" Tina snorted. "He would never sell a piece of his action to me. He's too butthurt. So set up a corporate entity in a state that prizes anonymity and have the corporation buy in. And leave a paper trail for the IRS? Come on, Gary. You know me better than that." "Apparently not. What are you doing here, and why is it my play?" Tina chuckled. "I'm taking over completely," she said, "and it's your play, because you're coming aboard with me. Gary stopped, swallowed, and looked at her. Hard. Why would I ever do something like that? I don't trust you as far as my pinky finger could throw you. No way am I going into business with you. I hate to break it with you, but you already are." "What?" Then he noticed that her left hand had moved and was now resting on her belly, and that belly was a bit less flat than when he had last seen it. Quite a bit less flat. He felt his eyes widening, and he looked back up at her to meet her eyes, a shiver of horror going up his spine. "Happy Father's Day," she said. And he didn't need to have to look at the calendar to know that that was at least 3 or 4 weeks off from where they were. "You gotta be shitting me." She shook her head. "Well, get an abortion." A more emphatic shake of her head. "I'm many things, but I'm not a murderer." Gary snorted. "Well, I'm many things, but I'm not dad material." Tina's eyebrows rose high. "You're gonna be." She paused for a moment, then said in a more consoling tone, "Unless you don't want to." "Which means what?" "Which means you fund my buy-in, or you get child support and alimony for the next 18 years. Gary blinked, then shook his head. "Alimony? We were never married." "Tell that to the judge, after your attorney racks up $50,000 in fees from all the paperwork I'm going to send his way." "You wouldn't." "You can't." "Can't I?" She smiled wickedly at him, then picked up her phone, which had been stashed away in her handbag, and held it up to him, screen facing his direction. On the screen he saw himself, with her, walking arm in arm down a white sand beach. Heard himself talking about wanting to marry her to start a family. But he'd never said anything like that, and they certainly had never walked arm in arm down the beach together. "What the—" "Deep fakes are grand," she said, her tone turning wicked. "Team them with adaptive AI algorithms, and there's no telling what you can make." Gary knew his chin was on his chest, but he couldn't make his mouth shut. Was she kidding? This couldn't really be happening, could it? But then he looked from her triumphant face to the phone screen, which looked to all the world like his real face and her simulacrum really her. And he swallowed. Hard. I don't have $500,000. Get it? Or it's the most expensive child support district in the nation. Tina's smile became a sneer. I read the other day it costs $300,000 to raise a kid from infancy to 18 these days, on average. But that's if you're in the boondocks and don't care which school your kid goes to. She raised her eyebrows high. I very much care, don't you? He didn't respond immediately, and she went on. Plus, I can't be a good mother if I have to be away at a job all day. I'll need financial and maybe other support as well. The kind of support a husband and father is supposed to provide, even if he's not with the mother anymore. And Gary knew he was beaten. He wasn't entirely sure how it had happened either. Oh, sure, he knew how babies were made, remembered vividly the several times with Tina back last summer, but he had tested as having mostly dead sperm, so he hadn't really worried about protection. Stupid, 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 stupid. Stupid, he said, looking skyward toward a bare, uncaring ceiling above his head, flat and completely devoid of anything even starting to resemble human responses to those stimuli. Don't be so hard on yourself, Tina said, sounding positively like the cat that had just eaten the canary. I mean, you weren't all that hard on me. And the twisted mockery in her tone just made the whole situation all that much worse. Gary wanted to sigh, but right then he couldn't do anything except nod in defeat. Tina really did laugh then. Okay, Mantrap, which came from Volume 2 of last year's 52 Stories in 2023 project. 5 volumes of 10, actually 4 volumes of 10 and 1 volume of 12 that I made last year and published through Kickstarters. It was pretty cool. So, Mantrap. Obviously, went from the PI thing to a little different. And, I mean, since I wrote it, I dig it. Obviously, I don't think it's the most perfect of stories I've ever written, but still, it's got some fun to it, and I hope you liked it. If you did, tell me what you liked about it below. If you didn't, tell me what you didn't like about it below in the comments. And definitely, you should subscribe to come back for next week, because next week is going to be that military sci-fi story that I mentioned before. It's called The Corvus Bridge. It's set in the universe that I created with the Icaran Confederation Navy. So, Navy in space doing Navy things. And in this case that we're talking about for next week, it's Navy doing Navy things in support of top secret experiments. So it's going to be cool, and you'll like it. So come back then. Assuming that you continue to like what I'm doing, make sure you go check out michaelkingswood.com/store. We can find all my books in whatever format you want for the most profit for me, because it goes straight to my company store, and not a corporate, but my company store, and bypass the middleman. You can, of course, go through all the retailing middlemen: Amazon, Barnes & Noble, iBooks, Kobo, you name it. I'm there. michaelkingswood.com/books2read. The number 2 will get you to that listing where you can click on the title and show you all the stores it's in. You can click on one and go to it, and hey, life is good. Other ways to support, besides obviously liking and subscribing and all that sort of thing, you can go to Substack, where I parallel these stories in text so you can read them instead of listening to them, and some other stories as well. In addition to subscribers get more stories than non-subscribers, and paid subscribers get more stories than unpaid subscribers. Funny how that works. Rolling over there, michaelkingswood.substack.com, and check that out. Or you can just throw some bucks at the Subscribe Star page, which not a lot going on with it because I haven't done much with it and it's relatively new. But would love to have people supporting there if you want to help keep the lights on. But that's all good. Let's see. Anything else to talk about before I hang up? No, I think I'm good. I'm contemplating adding some things to the regular schedule around here. Right now, the regular thing is just Story Saturday. And we occasionally do other fun stuff like the music thing I talked about before. But I'm thinking about looking at my overall workload of things I have to do and what I can commit to on a regular basis. And I think we're going to make a couple changes around here and keep you guys informed. But in the meantime, at the very least, next Saturday we'll do that Corvus Bridge story, and we'll continue on from there. So I hope you liked it. Hope to see you again next week. Until then, don't do anything I wouldn't do.